The 1989 arcade hit Final Fight set a new standard for the beat-em-up genre, with large character sprites, a choice of 3 fighters with different strengths and weaknesses, an abundance of on-screen enemies, and quick and responsive gameplay. I first played Final Fight at a candy store in my old neighborhood where I grew up and had a blast playing it. It was inevitable that Final Fight would make its way to home consoles, and it became a reality on December 21st, 1990, when it was ported to the Super Famicom, with the Super Nintendo port arriving the following year. I remember being impressed by how it looked when I saw it on an episode of GamePro TV. At the time, we did not own a Super Nintendo, but one of our neighbors did, and they had Final Fight for it, which I used to watch through their house window from a distance, and I was envious. By the time we got a Super Nintendo a couple of years later, we never bought Final Fight for it. While the Super Nintendo port was praised for its graphics, it was criticized for not having 2-player co-op, having only 2 of the 3 fighters selectable, and the omission of the industrial area stage, despite misleading articles published prior to the Super Nintendo release by EGM and GamePro magazines stating otherwise about co-op gameplay and the number of stages. In 1993, Final Fight saw another home port, this time on the Sega CD. When I bought the Sega CD a year later, Final Fight was a title that graced my library, so I finally had my opportunity to play this stud at home. We will go in depth to see how this version fares against the arcade. I used the North American Sega CD release to record gameplay for this review, along with Capcom Classics Collection for the PlayStation 2 for the arcade footage.
Metro City, a well-known crime capital, has been ruled by violence and death for many years.
The opening, intro, and ending were redone, featuring fully voiced dialogue, new artwork, and animations. My favorite parts are the knife through the picture and Cody smashing the glass. The voice acting is dull, especially the exchange between Hagar and Damned. I understand that this was the early days of CD-ROM gaming, but earlier games for this medium had better quality acting. The rest of the Attract mode features the character bios, but not the individual and co-op gameplay demonstrations.
Count me in.
Joy kicks in the moment you start the game, as all 3 fighters are selectable and 2-player co-op is available. The opening scene of Damned laughing and carrying Jessica, plus the fighters smashing the oil drums, are here. All 6 stages are present. You're given 5 credits to complete this game. If you're playing a 2-player game, those credits are shared by both players. Immediately you'll notice that the soundtrack has been redone, and the tempo for these tracks are fast and energetic with lots of synthesized electric guitar. I for one enjoy going to the CD menu to listen to these tracks. As for the other part of the audio, the sound effects, they are spot on. The different groans for each move and death are present, plus the sounds of smashing wooden, glass, and metal objects, along with the stabs and strikes of the weapons, and the cheers during the fight against Sodom are accurate. The only voice sample that I noticed was different from the arcade is when Bread cries, "Oh my car."
Oh my god.
Graphically, this port captures the details of the arcade, such as the urban decay of the slums with the smashed windows, flickering lights, and graffiti, the shaking motion of the subway train with the neglect and damage of the cars, and the elegant architecture of Belger's uptown digs. All the transitional scenes between sections are here. Of course, the graphics are not perfect. Details and objects are missing, such as less structural damage on the buildings in the slums, fewer people in the background in the restaurant and Chinatown portions of the west side, and the fence in the foreground in the beginning of the Bay Area. I noticed 2 sections between the industrial area and uptown where there is a missing layer of parallax scrolling. The color limitation of the console makes some areas look faded. However, these discrepancies don't hamper the overall quality of the graphics, which is excellent. Lots of censorship was applied to the North American version. Jessica is wearing a dress when you see her on the TV monitor, but in the Japanese version she wears a bra. The female enemies Roxy and Poison have longer tank tops and shorts. In the uncensored versions, the shorter tops meant that you could see the under part of their breasts when you punch them. There's no blood when you attack an enemy with the knife or sword. The first 2 bosses, Damned and Sodom, were renamed Thrasher and Katana respectively. The bar in the 3rd stage was renamed Club. The bathroom stalls in the Bay Area have the sexy graffiti removed. The pillars throughout Belger's building have carvings of a woman with their top covered as opposed to being uncovered. Health restoration items such as beer and whiskey were replaced with milk and vitamin drink. The Japanese Mega CD port was left uncensored. There are several gameplay differences that affect the difficulty of this port. The attack speed in this version is considerably slower than the arcade, even if you're using guide. This slows down the pace of the game and can leave you vulnerable if you're dealing with several enemies at once. There is a code that can be entered for auto fire which makes up for that. Go to the options menu and highlight exit. Hold right, buttons A and B, and then start. I recommend using this code to get the most enjoyment out of this port. There is a maximum of 4 enemies on screen. Since the enemy placement in both quantity and type is mostly consistent with the arcade version, you will need to clear out some foes before others can join the fracas. This can make things easier for the player. For example, in the elevator portion of the industrial area, enemies appear in several clusters. If you take too long to defeat one bunch, the next group will jump in. In this version, the next group of enemies will not appear unless the previous batch are defeated. Thus, you don't have to worry about fighting Andre, Roxy, and Poison with the Elgatos joining the action. This means that the fight against Rolento will be a one-on-one affair or 2-on-1 in co-op. In another example, there are areas where you fight a small group of enemies right before you encounter another group that kicks down oil drums. In this port, you would have to go through the first group of thugs before you can advance to the part with the oil drums. There are fewer weapons to pick up in some spots and fewer breakable objects to include oil drums that are kicked and rolled towards the player. If you are low on health or are in need of additional ways to bash some skulls, you may be in trouble. For example, the fight against the Andres in the ring has only 4 weapons to pick up versus 6 in the arcade. In another example, the last car of the subway train should have 5 barrels, but there are just 3 in this port. There are fewer chandeliers in the last level. There is a trick in the arcade version where if you stand on top of a barrel at the end of the subway train long enough, the train will come to a halt. I would use this tactic if I was low on health to avoid fighting the last group of baddies. I tried that trick in this version and it does not work. Once you are done saving Jessica, you could take on Mad Gear in the time attack mode. This mode features 3 new stages corresponding to each fighter, with the bridge for Guy, a parking lot for Cody, and Chinatown for Hager. You have 2 lives and a timer counting down from 99 to survive an endless onslaught of foes, which starts off easy but gets progressively harder the more enemies you defeat. Aside from the knives left behind by Hollywood and Elgato, there are no other weapons to pick up and there is no food to restore your health. The game ends when the timer reaches 0 or if you lose both lives. You're awarded 1 point for each defeated foe. This is a fun way to compete amongst friends for the highest score. The time attack mode can be played with 2 players. For many years after its release, the Sega CD port of Final Fight was as close as you could get to the arcade version at home, aside from the SharpX 68000 version which very few people owned. Excluding MAME or other emulators, it wouldn't be until 2005 before we officially received a fully accurate version of Final Fight for home consoles as part of the Capcom Classics collection for the PlayStation 2 and Xbox. It has since appeared in additional compilations for other consoles. These newer releases make the Sega CD port feel obsolete, but it was something special to play this version back in the 1990s prior to the further advances of computer and console hardware, which is why this port resonates well with me as it's an outstanding rendition of my all-time favorite brawler. Listening to the soundtrack is certainly worth the playthrough, and I think it's much better than the remixed tracks used for Final Fight Double Impact. Like many Sega CD titles, pricing for this game is high with a loose disc ranging from $30 to $50, so I recommend playing this on emulation if money's an issue. But if it's not, then this is a must-own title for any Sega CD owner. To finish off this video, we will show you more side-by-side footage of the arcade and Sega CD versions.